Father slapped poor Virgin for being broken. An hour later, 3 Amish men arrived and did what no one expected. Out on a Kansas farm, a young woman's secret shatters her world when her own father strikes her down in front of the neighbors. The echo of that slap carries through the dust, through the storm, and into the path of 3 quiet men in black coats and wide hats. They came to fix a barn, but found a soul worth rebuilding. As hammer meets nail and prayers meet tears, something begins to change, not just the farm, but every heart within miles. Yet mercy has a price, and the world won't stand still for kindness. When shame turns to redemption, when judgment meets grace, what will these strangers do that changes everything? And can one broken girl truly believe she's worth saving? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The Kansas sunset painted the sky in shades of dusty red, casting long shadows across the weathered farmyard. Isabella Beeman stood before her father, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron. The words she had dreaded speaking for so long finally tumbled out, quiet but clear as creek water. "Papa, the doctor says I can't have children. The fever when I was young, it—" Her voice cracked like dry earth. John Beeman's face, already ruddy from too many evenings with the bottle, darkened to a dangerous crimson. The neighbors who had gathered for the evening sermon watched from the porch, their faces a mix of pity and discomfort. Mrs. Anderson pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, while old Mr. Peterson looked away, suddenly fascinated by the dust on his boots. "Broken!" her father spat the word, his breath heavy with whiskey. "My only daughter, and you're broken." His voice rose like thunder across the yard, making the chickens scatter. "What man'll want you now? Who'll carry on our name?" Isabella flinched at each word, each one striking deeper than the last. "Papa, please!" The crack of his palm against her cheek echoed across the yard, sharp as a rifle shot. Someone gasped. The force of the blow sent Isabella stumbling backward, her hand flying to her face where heat bloomed like prairie fire. Tears burned her eyes as she turned and ran, her feet carrying her through the familiar path to the barn. Behind her, her father's curses chased her like angry hornets, mixing with the disapproving murmurs of the neighbors. The barn door groaned on its hinges as she slipped inside. The familiar smells of hay and leather wrapped around her like an old quilt as she climbed the ladder to the loft, her sanctuary since childhood. Her mother's Bible, worn smooth by years of faithful hands, pressed against her chest where she had tucked it that morning. Isabella curled into the hay, its scratchy embrace both comfort and penance. Through the gaps in the weathered boards, she watched the last light drain from the sky, leaving only purple shadows and the first bright stars. Crickets began their evening song, a chorus that had lulled her to sleep on countless summer nights. Her cheek throbbed in time with her heart. She touched it gently, remembering how her mother used to cup her face in those same spots, but with love instead of anger. "My sweet girl," she would say, "God's got special plans for you." But Mama was 6 years in the ground now, and Isabella wondered if God's plans included leaving her barren and alone. She opened the Bible, its pages soft as butter from years of turning. A pressed wildflower, purple prairie clover, marked her mother's favorite psalm. The words blurred as fresh tears fell, dotting the aged paper like summer rain. Outside, lanterns winked out one by one as the neighbors departed, their wagon wheels crunching on the packed earth of the yard. Their voices drifted up to her hiding place, carrying fragments of whispered conversations. Poor thing. Always knew John's temper would— What's to become of her now? Her father's heavy boots stumbled across the yard, accompanied by the clink of another bottle. The screen door slammed, and silence settled over the farm like a heavy blanket. Thunder growled in the distance, a low warning of storms to come. Isabella pressed her hand against the rough wood of the barn wall, feeling the first vibrations of approaching weather. The air grew thick with the promise of rain, seeping through the cracks to wrap around her like damp wool. She pulled her knees to her chest, making herself small in the growing darkness. The loft had always been her refuge, during Mama's passing, during Papa's worst drinking spells, during the lonely nights when the house felt too empty to bear. But now it felt different. Now it felt like exile. The Bible lay open in her lap, and even in the dimness, she could trace the familiar words with her finger. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the rustling hay. But for the first time in her life, those words rang hollow as a dry well. More thunder rolled across the prairie, closer now. Through the hayloft window, lightning flickered like distant lanterns, illuminating the vast Kansas sky. The storm was gathering strength, much like the one in her heart, wild, unpredictable, and full of dangerous promise. Isabella touched her mother's dried flower, its delicate petals still holding their color after all these years. Like the flower, she felt pressed between pages, preserved but no longer growing, cut off from life's natural course. The thought that she would never hold a child of her own, never rock a baby to sleep or teach small hands to pray, settled over her like a shadow. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, drumming against the barn roof in a rhythm as familiar as her own heartbeat. Isabella drew deeper into the hay, pulling an old horse blanket around her shoulders. As night deepened around her, she wondered if, like this storm, this too would pass, leaving behind either destruction or blessed relief. But for now, in the darkness of the barn loft, Isabella Beeman felt as empty as the barren fields beyond, waiting for a harvest that would never come. An hour into the night, thunder growled closer, shaking the old barn's timbers. Isabella stirred from her tear-soaked stupor at the sound of wagon wheels crunching up the lane. Through gaps in the weathered boards, she glimpsed lantern light swaying in the darkness. 3 men in plain, dark clothing guided their wagon to a stop. Their broad-brimmed hats marked them as Amish, and they spoke in low, measured tones as they assessed the brewing storm. The eldest, tall and steady in his movements, lifted his lantern toward the house. "English," he called out, using the Amish term for non-Amish folk. "Might we shelter here until the storm passes?" The screen door creaked, and Henry Beeman's heavy boots thumped across the porch. "Who comes at this hour?" His words slurred slightly, thick with whiskey and lingering anger. "Noah Stoltzfus and my brothers, Matthew and Jonas. We're barn builders, heading north to the Miller farm." The eldest brother's voice carried calm authority. "The storm's bearing down fast." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene. Isabella could see them clearly now. 3 bearded men in simple clothes, their faces earnest and weathered. The youngest looked barely older than she was, while the middle brother had a friendly, open countenance. But it was Noah, the eldest, whose presence drew her attention. He stood straight and sure, like a well-rooted oak. A gust of wind caught the barn door, throwing it against the wall with a crack. Isabella startled, and her movement caught Noah's eye. Their gazes met through the shadows, and she quickly looked away, conscious of her tear-stained face and the bruise darkening her cheek. Henry spat into the dust. "Ain't running no charity house here." But another roll of thunder changed his mind. "They'll reckon you ought to earn your supper if you're staying." Matthew spoke up, his voice cheerful despite the tension. "We'd be glad to help where needed. Noticed your barn door needs attention." "Jonas," Noah directed, "see to the mules. Matthew, bring in our tools." He turned to Henry with quiet dignity. "We're much obliged for your hospitality." Isabella watched as they efficiently unhitched their team. Jonas, the youngest, had a gentle way with the animals, speaking to them in soft Pennsylvania German as he led them toward the barn. He paused at the sight of her in the loft, but said nothing, only nodding respectfully. The brothers gathered in the kitchen, where Isabella had left a pot of bean soup cooling. The room felt different with their presence, calmer, as if their steadiness could smooth the rough edges of her father's anger. They removed their hats and sat quietly while Noah spoke a prayer in German. "Danke," he concluded, then switched to English. "We thank you for this food and shelter." Henry grudgingly pushed a loaf of bread across the table. Isabella crept down from the loft and slipped in through the back door, keeping to the shadows. But Noah's eyes found her again, seeing past her attempt to hide. "Will you join us, sister?" he asked softly. The invitation held no judgment, only kindness. Before she could respond, her father's chair scraped back. "Girl can eat in the barn with the horses where she belongs." He stumbled to his feet. "I'm done with this day." The brothers remained silent until Henry's heavy footsteps faded upstairs. Then Matthew reached for the bread knife. "There's plenty here to share." Jonas poured fresh milk into cups, while Noah broke the bread into equal portions. Without ceremony, Matthew carried a plate to where Isabella stood, his eyes kind but not pitying. "God's peace to you, sister." The simple gesture, being served instead of serving, nearly broke her composure again. She accepted the plate with trembling hands, managing a whispered, "Thank you." Rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the tin roof. Noah rose, his movements deliberate. "We should see to the animals before the worst hits." He turned to Isabella. "Your father mentioned repairs. With your permission, we'll start at first light." Isabella nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched as the brothers donned their hats and headed out to secure the barn for the night. Their lantern light swayed through the downpour, and their quiet voices carried snatches of hymns as they worked. For the first time since her father's cruel words had shattered the evening peace, Isabella felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin. These strangers had brought something with them, carried it as naturally as they carried their tools. Grace, she realized. They had brought grace into a house that had forgotten its meaning. Through the window, she watched Noah lead the last mule into the barn. Even in the rain, he moved with purpose and care, as if every task, no matter how humble, deserved full attention. When he glanced back towards the house, she didn't look away this time. In the lantern's glow, she saw something in his eyes that spoke of understanding, of wounds healed and burdens shared. The rain settled into a steady rhythm as the brothers prepared their pallets in the barn. Their arrival had changed something in the very air of the farm, as if their presence had begun to wash away the bitter words that had poisoned the evening. Morning came softly to the Kansas farm, sunlight cutting through rain-damp clouds like fingers through flour. The storm had left everything fresh-washed, and puddles reflected the clearing sky. From the kitchen window, Isabella watched the Stoltzfus brothers already at work, their steady movements matching the rhythm of distant meadowlarks. Noah's saw rasped through damaged boards while Matthew measured new fence posts. Jonas, the youngest, sorted through their tools with careful attention. Their plain, dark clothes were already dusty with honest work, and their quiet efficiency made the morning feel almost peaceful. Isabella turned back to her biscuit dough, working it with practiced hands. The familiar task felt different today, lighter somehow. Through the open window, she could hear the brothers speaking in Pennsylvania German as they worked, their voices mixing with hammer strikes and the whisper of planes over wood. "Something smells mighty fine," Noah said from the doorway, making her start. He stood with his hat in his hands, respectfully waiting to be invited in. "Just breakfast," Isabella replied softly, sliding the biscuits into the oven. "Nothing special." "Every meal is special when shared with thanks," Noah said, his voice gentle but firm. He stepped inside at her gesture and settled at the table, his movements unhurried. When the biscuits emerged golden brown, Noah's quiet praise surprised a laugh from Isabella, a sound she hadn't heard from her own lips in weeks. It bubbled up unexpected as a spring, bright and clear in the morning quiet. The screen door's creak cut the moment short. Henry Beeman stood there, watching them with narrowed eyes. His gaze flickered between his daughter's smile and the Amish man's presence, and something dark crossed his face. "Thought you came to work, not socialize?" he said, the words sharp-edged despite the early hour. "Yes, sir," Noah replied evenly, rising. "We'll have your barn sound by sundown." He nodded thanks to Isabella and stepped back into the morning light. As the sun climbed higher, wagons began passing on the road. Isabella could hear the whispers carrying across the yard. "Them's holy men the Beemans hired. Amish builders, all the way from Pennsylvania. Here they pray while they work." Her father paced the porch, watching every movement. His face grew darker each time someone called out a greeting, each time Isabella carried water to the workers, each time Noah's quiet "thank you" made her duck her head to hide a smile. Near midday, Isabella found herself drawn to where Noah worked alone, sanding a fallen board smooth. His hands moved with sure purpose, and he smiled when he saw her watching. "Would you like to learn?" he asked, holding out the sanding block. Isabella glanced toward the house, but her father had gone to the back field. She stepped forward, accepting the tool. Noah's hands guided hers, showing her how to work with the grain. "See here," he said. "We can carve words into it, make something beautiful from what was broken." He took out his penknife and began carefully etching letters. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." "We need work, not scripture." Her father's voice cracked across the yard like summer lightning. He stood at the corner of the barn, a whiskey bottle dangling from one hand. "I ain't paying you to teach my girl your fancy ways." "You haven't paid us anything, Mr. Beeman," Noah said quietly, standing to face him. "We work to serve God and neighbor, not for payment." The bottle shattered against the barn wall. "Don't need your charity or your preaching. Get back to work or get off my land." The afternoon stretched long and tense. The brothers worked steadily, speaking only when necessary. Isabella kept to the kitchen, but she could feel her father's eyes following her every movement through the windows. As evening settled in, the brothers gathered for their prayers before supper. Their voices carried soft and clear across the yard, singing an old German hymn that made Isabella's throat tight with longing for something she couldn't name. Later, as darkness crept in, she carried scraps out to the barn cats. Noah was checking the animals one last time, and they found themselves alone by the barn door. "Thank you," Isabella said softly, "for the lesson today. I've never made anything beautiful before." "That's not true," Noah replied. "There's beauty in how you care for this place, even when it's hard, in how you—" "Get away from my daughter!" Henry Beeman's roar shattered the evening quiet. He came stumbling out of the shadows, face twisted with rage and jealousy. "You think I can't see what you're doing? Turning her against me with your gentle ways and prayers?" Noah stepped carefully away from Isabella, hands raised. "No, sir, that's not—" "I want you and your brothers gone by sunrise," Henry spat. "Take your tools and your scripture and get off my land. We don't need your kind here." The words fell heavy in the gathering dark. Isabella felt something inside her crack and crumble, like a dry creek bed giving way. The fragile peace of the day shattered, leaving only the bitter taste of her father's jealousy and the memory of Noah's kindness, already fading like the last light in the western sky. Dawn painted the Kansas sky in watercolor shades of pink and gray. Isabella stood barefoot in the dew-wet grass, her feet going numb as she watched the Stoltzfus brothers load their wagon. The morning air carried the musty scent of wet earth and the metallic ring of tools being packed away. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks as Noah secured the last of their equipment. He paused beside her, his broad-brimmed hat casting shadows across his gentle face. "God sends helpers twice if the first time man says no," he said softly, his words meant for her ears alone. Isabella wanted to respond, to beg him to stay, but her throat felt tight as a fist. She could only watch as the brothers climbed onto their wagon. The wheels creaked through mud left by yesterday's rain, carrying them down the lane until they disappeared around the bend. The slam of the screen door made her jump. Her father's heavy boots crunched across the yard, and Isabella caught the familiar sour smell of whiskey on his breath. "Good riddance to their preaching," he muttered, then turned to face her. His next words fell like stones into still water. "You're marrying Silas Durgan." Isabella's head snapped up. "What?" "Widower Durgan needs a wife to keep house. Offered to pay off my debts in exchange." Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. "He's coming for you today." "No." The word came out barely above a whisper. "Father, please." "You'll do as you're told." His hand clamped around her arm. "Time you learned obedience under another roof, since you won't learn it here." Isabella struggled as he dragged her toward the house. "I won't go, you can't." "Can't I?" He shoved her through the door. "Pack your things. Wagon will be here within the hour." With trembling hands, Isabella gathered what little she owned: 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a hairbrush, and the small quilt she'd made as a girl. Each item felt like lead as she placed it in the carpet bag. The wagon arrived with the sound of heavy wheels and stamping hooves. Silas Durgan sat rigid on the bench, his face as weathered as old leather. He barely looked at Isabella as her father handed her up beside him. The journey stretched endlessly through the Kansas countryside. Cold wind whipped at Isabella's skirts and hair, but the silence between her and Durgan was colder still. Mile after mile passed beneath the wagon wheels as the sun climbed high and then began its slow descent. They stopped only once, to water the horses at a creek. Isabella stood apart, arms wrapped around herself, watching hawks circle overhead and wishing she could fly away with them. Durgan spoke only to hurry her back into the wagon. Late afternoon found them approaching a sprawling ranch house, its windows dark despite the gathering dusk. A thin woman with iron-gray hair stood waiting on the porch, her mouth set in a hard line. "Mrs. Fowler," Durgan called out as he helped Isabella down. "Show her where things are kept." The housekeeper's eyes raked over Isabella, cold as frost. "This way," she said curtly, turning on her heel. Isabella followed Mrs. Fowler through the house, trying to memorize the layout as the woman rattled off instructions. Kitchen here, root cellar there, master's study strictly forbidden. Each room felt more oppressive than the last, weighted with unspoken rules and expectations. "You'll sleep there." Mrs. Fowler pointed to a narrow door off the kitchen. "Breakfast at 5 sharp. Master likes his eggs turned just so." She paused, fixing Isabella with a stern look. "And don't go getting ideas above your station. You're here to work, nothing more." Left alone in the small room, Isabella sank onto the narrow bed. The truth settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had traded one prison for another. Her father's rage for Durgan's cold authority, the farm's familiar constraints for these strange new walls. She unpacked her few belongings with shaking hands. When she pulled out her mother's Bible, a small piece of wood fell from between its pages. The board Noah had helped her sand, with its half-carved hymn verse still visible in the lamplight. Isabella traced the letters with her finger, remembering his quiet strength, his gentle teachings. The sound of boots in the hallway made her quickly hide the piece of wood beneath her mattress. As keys turned in locks and darkness crept across the prairie, Isabella curled up on her bed, still fully dressed. Tears slipped silently onto her pillow as she remembered Noah's parting words about God sending helpers twice. But in this cold house, with its locked doors and watching eyes, even that promise felt as distant as the stars now appearing in the Kansas sky. Days melted one into another at the Durgan Ranch, each sunrise bringing endless work that left Isabella's hands raw and her spirit weary. She rose before dawn to kindle the kitchen fire, her movements careful and quiet in the gray darkness. The rooster's crow found her already kneading bread dough, while the first rays of sun caught her hauling water from the well. Morning till night, she scrubbed floors until her knees ached, blackened with soot from tending fires, and cooked endless meals that were met with nothing but criticism. Silas Durgan's presence filled the house like a storm cloud, his heavy boots echoing through the rooms as he searched for faults in her work. "Girl's got her head in the clouds again," he would mutter to Mrs. Fowler, who answered with thin-lipped nods. "Look at those daydream eyes. Won't get the work done proper that way." Isabella kept her eyes lowered and her tongue still, but her thoughts often drifted to the farm she'd left behind, to Noah's kind words, and to the father who had cast her out. She found small comforts where she could, in the warmth of fresh bread, in brief moments watching meadowlarks flit across the yard, in quiet prayers whispered in the darkness of her room. One evening, as Isabella ladled out stew for the ranch hands, she overheard snippets of conversation that made her blood run cold. "Saw the lightning strike clear as day," said Tom Wheeler, one of the newer hands. "Hit that old Beeman barn straight on, crack of thunder like God himself was angry." The iron ladle slipped from Isabella's grip, clattering against the wooden floor. Hot stew splashed across her skirts, but she barely noticed the burn. "Clean that up," Silas barked from the head of the table. "And mind you don't waste more good food with your clumsiness." Isabella's hands trembled as she wiped up the spill, her mind racing with images of her father's farm in flames. That night, long after the house fell silent, she knelt by the dying embers in the hearth. The orange glow painted shadows across her face as she prayed, tears falling freely now that no one could see them. "Please, Lord," she whispered, hands clasped tight, "spare him. And help me forgive him too." The days that followed were heavy with worry. Isabella worked harder than ever, trying to drown her fears in physical labor. She scrubbed pots until they gleamed, swept the porch 3 times a day, anything to keep her mind from wandering to thoughts of home. A week passed before news arrived with Jeremiah Collins, a peddler who traveled the county roads. Isabella was hanging sheets on the line when his wagon rattled up to the house. As she helped carry his wares inside, he shared the gossip from up and down the road. "Shame about that Beeman place," he said, shaking his head. "Flood took out half his crops, then that lightning strike finished off the barn. Nothing left but charred timbers, I heard." Isabella gripped the doorframe to steady herself, grateful that Mrs. Fowler was too busy examining the peddler's cloth to notice her reaction. She waited until evening, when the house was quiet, before letting her tears fall. In the privacy of her small room, she pressed her face into her pillow to muffle her sobs. Yet even in her grief, something stirred in Isabella's heart. Not defeat, but a quiet determination. She began to notice things she'd been too busy to see before. The hungry faces of children when wagons passed by on the road, the exhausted droop of travelers' shoulders as they asked for water from the well. Without a word to anyone, Isabella started saving scraps from the kitchen. A heel of bread here, a wrapped piece of cheese there, tucked carefully into her apron pockets. When she hung the washing out, she would watch for those passing children. A quick gesture would bring them to the fence, where small hands would reach eagerly for the food she offered. "God bless you, miss," they would whisper, and Isabella's heart would lift a little, remembering Noah's words about being God's hands in the world. These small acts of mercy became her quiet rebellion against the harshness around her. Each piece of food shared, each kind word whispered, felt like tiny flowers pushing through cracks in the hard ground of her circumstances. She couldn't change her situation, but she could choose how to live within it. Silas never noticed the missing scraps, too absorbed in his ledgers and his criticism. Mrs. Fowler's sharp eyes were focused on keeping the house running to her exacting standards. And so Isabella continued her secret ministry, finding that in giving comfort to others, she discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The days were still long, the work still hard, but Isabella's daydream eyes now held a purpose that no amount of harsh words could dim. In helping others, she kept her own soul alive, like a candle burning steady against the darkness. Frost settled over the Kansas plains like a delicate shroud, painting the grass silver in the wan morning light. Isabella watched the changing season from the kitchen window while she kneaded bread, noting how the autumn wind stripped the last leaves from the cottonwoods. The land seemed to be pulling inward, preparing for winter's long sleep. In town, worried whispers passed, between neighbors about signs of hard times ahead. Farmers spoke of withered crops and empty granaries, while ranchers counted their losses in failing cattle. The drought had stretched on far too long, and now blight crept through the wheat fields like a silent plague. One gray afternoon, while Isabella scrubbed the kitchen floor, Silas Durgan's horse thundered into the yard. His boots struck the porch boards like hammer blows as he stormed inside, trailing mud across her clean floor. "Whole county's gone to seed," he growled, throwing his hat onto the table. "Beeman Farm's falling to pieces. That fool's laid up with fever, they say. 3 barns collapsed just this past week." His voice dropped to a cruel whisper. "Folk are saying it's God's judgment come down on him." Isabella's hands stilled on the scrub brush, her heart clenching at news of her father. The thought of him sick and alone in that empty house pressed against her chest like a stone. She kept her head down, pretending to focus on a stubborn stain, while Silas continued his angry pacing. That evening, after the house settled into silence, Isabella sat at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper saved from a flour sack. The lamp's weak light flickered across the page as she carefully formed each letter. "Dear Reverend Hayes, please pray for my father. He is ill and alone. I know he has done wrong, but the good book speaks of mercy. Your servant in Christ, Isabella Beeman." Her hand trembled as she folded the paper small enough to hide beneath the flour tin. On market day, she would find a way to mail it, though the thought of defying Silas's unspoken rules made her stomach twist with anxiety. The next morning brought heavy clouds that soon burst into a relentless downpour. Thunder rolled across the prairie as rain hammered the roof for 2 days straight, turning the roads to mud and keeping everyone close to home. During this forced confinement, Mrs. Fowler discovered a sickly calf in the barn, soaked through and shivering. "Poor creature won't last the night," the housekeeper declared, her usual stern expression softening with concern. Isabella followed her to the barn, carrying old blankets and a pot of warm milk. Together they worked to dry the calf and coax it to drink. Through the long hours of the storm, Isabella stayed close to the animal, singing hymns softly while she stroked its trembling sides. Mrs. Fowler brought them both hot coffee and watched with growing approval as Isabella's gentle persistence was rewarded with the calf's strengthening attempts to stand. "You've got away with suffering things," Mrs. Fowler said quietly, passing Isabella a fresh blanket. It wasn't quite praise, but the ice in her voice had thawed somewhat. When the storm finally broke, sunshine spilled across the rain-washed prairie like honey. Isabella stood at the clothesline, hanging sheets that snapped in the fresh wind. Movement on the horizon caught her eye. 3 wagons, approaching, their plain gray shapes distinctive against the bright sky. Her heart leaped with recognition. Even at this distance, she knew those wagons, knew the steady gait of those horses. The Stoltzfus brothers had returned, their arrival like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Isabella's hands fell still on the damp sheet as she watched their slow approach. Each creak of their wagon wheels seemed to whisper of providence, of God's timing being perfect even when hope seemed lost. The letter beneath the flour tin, her father's illness, the softening of Mrs. Fowler's heart, all these threads seemed to be weaving together into a pattern she couldn't yet fully see, but one that stirred her spirit with the first real hope she'd felt since leaving home. A meadowlark's song pierced the morning air, clear and sweet. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sunshine warm her face as the wagons drew steadily closer. Perhaps Noah had been right after all. God did send helpers twice when they were most needed. The 3 wagons rolled to a stop in Silas Durgan's yard, wagon wheels creaking against the morning silence. Isabella's heart hammered as she watched Noah Stoltzfus climb down from the lead wagon, his movements deliberate and measured. The months had weathered him, new lines creased his face, and his bearing seemed more stern than she remembered. But when his eyes met hers across the yard, she saw the same gentle kindness that had given her hope during those few precious days at her father's farm. Behind him, his brothers began unloading supplies, rough-cut lumber stacked high, sacks of flour and seed corn tied down with rope. The sight of such abundance in these lean times drew curious looks from Silas's ranch hands, who paused in their morning chores to watch. Silas emerged from the house, boots striking the porch boards with sharp authority. "What's all this, then?" he demanded, gesturing at the wagons. Noah turned to face him, his voice steady and clear in the morning air. "We bring help for those in need. The drought's been hard on many farms hereabouts." "Pity doesn't plow fields," Silas scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. Noah met his gaze without flinching. "Neither does pride," he replied quietly. The simple truth in those words seemed to hover in the air between them. Silas's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, more wagons appeared on the road, families drawn by word of the brothers' arrival. Their desperation was written in hollow cheeks and threadbare clothing. Isabella continued hanging laundry, stealing glances at the growing crowd while trying to avoid Silas's attention. When he stormed back inside, she seized her chance. Slipping behind the barn where the washing lines ended, she found Noah waiting, as if he'd known she would come. "I thought God had forgotten me," she whispered, the confession burning her throat like bitter medicine. Noah shook his head, reaching into his pocket. "The Lord never does," he said, pressing something into her palm. Isabella opened her fingers to reveal a small wooden dove, expertly carved. Every feather was detailed with loving care, its wings spread in eternal flight. Tears blurred her vision as she traced its smooth surface with her thumb. The sound of approaching wagons grew steadily throughout the morning. Word spread like wildfire across the parched prairie. The Amish brothers were rebuilding barns for free, distributing food to those in need. Soon a line of desperate families stretched down the road, their wagons and carts kicking up dust in the autumn sun. Noah organized the distribution with quiet efficiency, his brothers working steadily beside him. Isabella watched from the kitchen window as she prepared the midday meal, her hands moving automatically through familiar tasks, while her heart ached to help. Near sunset, Noah approached the house. Isabella held her breath as he spoke with Silas on the porch, their voices too low to make out the words. But she caught phrases here and there. Many mouths to feed, and Christian charity, and what neighbors might think. Finally, Silas stepped into the kitchen, his expression stormy. "The Amish fellow wants to know if you might help with distributing bread to these people," he said gruffly. "Says they could use someone with a woman's touch to organize things." He glared out the window at the waiting families. "Don't want folks thinking I'm heartless, turning away hungry children. You can help, but mind you keep up with your regular duties here." Isabella nodded, careful to hide her joy behind a mask of calm acceptance. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The next morning, she joined the brothers as they began their work of mercy. Her hands found purpose in measuring flour, wrapping bread, and writing down names of those in need. Each face that passed before her told a story of hardship. Each murmured, "Thank you," a prayer of gratitude. Noah worked nearby, his quiet strength drawing others to him like iron to a lodestone. He spoke little, but his actions preached louder than any sermon, measuring grain, lifting heavy loads, offering a kind word here and there. The dove he'd carved sat warm in Isabella's apron pocket, a constant reminder that she wasn't forgotten or worthless. As the sun climbed higher, more wagons appeared on the horizon. The brothers' mercy had sparked something in the community. Those who received help began helping others, sharing what little they had. Isabella saw it in the way neighbors greeted each other, in the small acts of kindness that multiplied like ripples in a pond. Even Mrs. Fowler joined the effort, bringing out coffee and biscuits for the waiting families. And though Silas remained aloof, watching from his porch, Isabella noticed he made no move to stop the growing wave of generosity that had washed up on his land. For the first time since leaving home, Isabella felt truly useful, truly alive. Each piece of bread she handed out, each child she comforted, each prayer she shared became a stitch mending her torn spirit. God's mercy had indeed returned to the land, as visible as the dust motes dancing in the autumn sunlight, as real as the wooden dove pressed against her heart. The morning sun cast long shadows through the old church windows as Isabella led a group of women through its dusty interior. Their footsteps echoed off bare wooden walls that hadn't seen care in many seasons. She carried a bucket of soapy water, her sleeves already rolled up for the work ahead. "We'll start with the windows," Isabella called out, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Let's get God's light shining in here proper again." The women moved with purpose, their skirts tied up and kerchiefs protecting their hair from dust. Rags squeaked against glass, and the morning light grew clearer with each stroke. Someone began humming an old hymn, and soon others joined in, their voices rising to the rafters like prayer. Outside, Noah and his brothers had set up their woodworking station. The steady rhythm of their saws and hammers provided a foundation for the women's songs. Isabella caught glimpses of Noah through the windows as he worked, carefully carving letters into a broad piece of oak. Children from town began arriving, drawn by the activity. Instead of shooing them away, Isabella put them to work carrying brushes and songbooks. They scampered about like eager chicks, proud to be trusted with real tasks. "Miss Beeman, can I help paint?" little Sarah Miller asked, her eyes bright with hope. Of course you can, Isabella smiled, showing her how to dip the brush just right. Remember, slow and steady makes the prettiest stroke. By midday, the church walls gleamed with fresh white paint. The children had proven surprisingly careful workers, their small hands perfect for reaching into corners adults couldn't manage. Isabella felt a warmth in her chest watching them work together, sharing brushes and encouraging each other. Noah entered as they were finishing the last wall. He carried the piece he'd been carving, a beautiful header board with the words, "Grace endures," cut deep into the wood. "It's ready to mount," he said softly, holding it up so everyone could see. The letters were perfect, each one carved with loving attention. "Would you like to help me place it, Isabella?" She nodded, following him outside where his brothers waited with the ladder. Together they positioned the sign above the church doorway. The fresh wood stood out against the weathered frame, like a promise of renewal. As the sun began to set, people gathered for evening service. The newly cleaned church seemed to glow from within, lamplight reflecting off pristine walls. Isabella sat near the back, a carved wooden plaque hidden in her apron pocket, her gift to Noah, worked on in secret moments between tasks. Noah stood to read from scripture, his voice clear and strong in the hushed space. "Sing, O barren one, who did not bear. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not been in labor." The words from Isaiah wrapped around Isabella's heart like a warm embrace. "For the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married, says the Lord." Tears filled Isabella's eyes as the truth of those words sank in. She wasn't worthless. She wasn't forgotten. The Lord had other plans for her life, other ways she could nurture and care for others. After the service, as people filed out into the cool evening air, Isabella approached Noah. Her hands trembled slightly as she withdrew the plaque she'd carved. The hymn verses weren't as perfect as his work, but she'd poured her heart into every letter. "I made this for you," she said quietly, holding it out, "to thank you for everything." Noah took the plaque carefully, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch sent a flutter through her chest, and she saw in his eyes that he felt it too. He studied the carved words, tracing them with gentle fingers. "This is beautiful work," he murmured. "You have a gift for bringing beauty from raw things." They stood in comfortable silence as the last lanterns were being dimmed. The bond between them felt almost visible in the soft light, like golden threads weaving their hearts together. "Every heart the Lord mends bears a scar," Noah whispered, his voice tender with understanding. "It's proof it was once broken." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Isabella felt truly seen, not for her wounds or her limitations, but for the strength that had grown from them. The evening crickets began their song as the last churchgoers headed home. Isabella watched the carved sign above the door, its fresh letters catching the last rays of sunset. Grace endures, indeed, in restored buildings, in healing hearts, and in the quiet moments between two souls, discovering they were meant to help make each other whole. The first frost came early that year, painting the prairie grass silver and brittle. Isabella watched through the ranch house window as hungry families still came seeking help from the Stoltzfus brothers, their wagons creaking under the weight of need. Though the church restoration had lifted spirits, empty bellies could not be filled with hope alone. She had just finished wrapping leftover bread for a widow when Silas stormed in, his boots leaving mud trails across her clean floor. His face was dark with anger. "I hear you've been giving away our stores," he growled, pointing at the bread bundle. "First the church, now this. Those plain folk have turned your head with their preaching." Isabella straightened her spine, though her hands trembled. "The Lord commands us to share with those in need." "The Lord?" Silas spat. "Where was he when my Catherine died? When drought took half my herd?" He stepped closer, looming over her. "You work for me now, girl. Your loyalty belongs here." "My soul answers first to God," Isabella said quietly, meeting his gaze. "No earthly master can change that." Silas's face twisted. His fist slammed into the wall beside her head, making her flinch. But when she looked up, she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not rage, but fear. He couldn't hold her gaze, turning away instead. "You're forbidden from helping those brothers anymore," he muttered. "Stay on the ranch where you belong." 3 days later, a rider brought news that stopped Isabella's heart mid-beat. Her father had taken ill with pneumonia, the wet cough that took so many during winter. He was bedridden, possibly dying. That evening, she approached Silas as he sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. "Please," she said, "let me visit him, just for a day." "Your father sold you to pay his debts," Silas replied without looking up. "You owe him nothing." "He's still my father." Isabella's voice cracked. "If he dies, the answer is no." The rifle clicked shut with finality. "This discussion is finished." That night, Isabella lay awake, listening to the wind howl outside her window. The moon cast silver light across her quilt, and in its glow, she made her choice. Quietly, she pulled on her warmest dress and shawl. She packed a small bundle, bread, dried apple, her mother's Bible. The house creaked its familiar songs as she crept down the stairs. The night air bit through her clothes as she slipped out the kitchen door. She knew taking a horse would be theft, so she set out on foot, following the river road north. The moon lit her path between the bare trees, and she whispered prayers with each steaming breath. Hour after hour she walked, her feet growing numb in their thin boots. The endless prairie stretched around her, broken only by the silver ribbon of river. Coyotes called in the distance, making her heart jump, but she pressed on. Her father's face haunted her thoughts, not the angry man who had struck her, but the gentle one who used to sing her to sleep after mother died. As false dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Isabella's legs finally betrayed her. She stumbled toward a haystack visible in the growing light, her vision blurring with exhaustion. The rough hay scratched her cheek as she sank against it. Just a moment's rest, she thought, as her eyes drifted closed. The creak of wagon wheels roused her slightly, but she couldn't lift her head. Boots crunched on frozen grass, coming closer. "Isabella?" A familiar voice cut through her fog. "Dear Lord, what are you doing out here?" Strong arms lifted her, and she recognized Matthew Stoltzfus's concerned face swimming above her. He wrapped her in a rough blanket that smelled of fresh-cut pine. "Found her by chance," she heard him telling someone else as consciousness faded. "Was hauling timber for the miller's barn when I saw something by the stack. Providence, that's what it was. Pure providence." The last thing Isabella felt was the gentle sway of the wagon as Matthew carried her to safety. And she thanked God for sending helpers twice, just as Noah had promised. Her father's face floated in her mind as she drifted off. This time, she prayed, there would be forgiveness for them both. Matthew's wagon rattled down the familiar lane to the Beeman farm, each bump jolting Isabella more awake. The sight that greeted her made her heart clench. The barn was a blackened skeleton against the pewter sky, and the house slumped like a wounded creature, its windows dark and shutters hanging loose. "Lord have mercy," Matthew whispered, helping her down from the wagon. Isabella's legs shook as she took in the ruin of her childhood home. Smoke still wisped from the chimney, the only sign of life. The front door creaked open before they reached it. Pastor Miller emerged, his kind face grave. "Isabella," he said softly, "you've come just in time." Inside, the house was cold despite the meager fire. Dust lay thick on the furniture, and the floorboards groaned under their feet as the pastor led them to her father's bedroom. The smell of sickness hung heavy in the air. Her father lay small and gray against the pillows, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rattling breaths. His eyes were closed, but they fluttered open at their entrance. When he saw Isabella, tears immediately welled and tracked down his sunken cheeks. "My girl," he wheezed. "My Isabella." She rushed to his bedside, clasping his rough hand between her own. His fingers were like ice. "Father," she whispered. "Forgive me," he begged, his voice breaking. "I was wrong, so wrong. The drink, the debts, the shame I brought, the way I treated you." A coughing fit racked his frame. Isabella pressed his hand to her cheek, her own tears falling. "I forgave you long ago, Father. Rest easy now." He shook his head weakly. "You should know. The bank's taking the farm. End of the week. I couldn't save it." His breath hitched. "Your mother would be so ashamed of what I become." "She would be proud of your repentance," Isabella said firmly. "As am I." Matthew and the pastor quietly left them alone. Through the afternoon and into evening, Isabella sat beside her father's bed. As darkness gathered and snow began to drift against the window panes, she read from the Psalms by candlelight, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Her father's breathing grew more labored as night deepened. Sometimes he would stir and mumble her mother's name. Isabella dampened his lips with water and adjusted his pillows, singing hymns softly when he grew restless. The candle burned low, and the snow fell thicker outside. Isabella prayed through the dark hours, asking God to grant her father peace. Near dawn, his breathing changed. His eyes opened, suddenly clear, and fixed on something beyond her shoulder. "Sarah," he whispered, her mother's name. A small smile touched his lips. Then his chest fell still, and he was gone. Tears blurring her vision, Isabella gently closed his eyes. "Thank you, Lord," she prayed, "for bringing him back to you before the end." The pale winter morning was just breaking when she heard wagon wheels outside. Heavy boots stomped snow from the porch, and then Noah's voice called softly, "Isabella?" She met him in the front room, where weak sunlight filtered through frosted windows. His face was drawn with concern, and snow dusted his broad shoulders. "I followed your tracks from Silas's ranch," he explained, "when Matthew told me where he found you." He trailed off, taking in her tear-stained face. "Your father?" "Gone to glory," she whispered. "But in peace, Noah. In peace at last." Understanding and compassion filled his eyes. Without a word, he opened his arms, and Isabella stepped into them, letting his strength hold her up as grief and relief mingled in her heart. The snow fell silently outside, covering the scarred land in clean white, as if God himself were laying a gentle blanket over all that had passed. In the growing light, Isabella could see fresh tracks in the snow, more wagons approaching. The other brothers were coming, bringing help as they always did. Even in death, she realized, God's mercy flowed like a river, washing away the old and making all things new. The morning sun struggled through heavy clouds as Isabella stood on the worn porch steps, her father's Bible pressed close against her heart. Each breath of winter air stung her lungs, still raw from a night of grief and prayer. Behind her, the house seemed to hold its breath, empty now of her father's presence, but full of memories, both bitter and sweet. The crunch of hooves on snow drew her attention to the road. 2 riders approached through the swirling flakes, Sheriff Mitchell and Mr. Blackwood from the bank, their dark coats stark against the white landscape. Isabella's fingers tightened on the Bible's leather cover, its familiar texture giving her strength. She had known they would come. The men dismounted, their boots leaving deep prints in the fresh snow. Sheriff Mitchell's weathered face showed genuine sympathy as he removed his hat, revealing gray hair frosted with snowflakes. Mr. Blackwood clutched a leather portfolio, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Beeman," the sheriff said softly, "we've come about the property." He glanced at the sheet-draped form visible through the front window, where her father's body lay waiting for burial. "Though perhaps this might wait." "No," Isabella said quietly. "Father knew this was coming. I'm prepared to surrender the deed." Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat. "The bank holds final claim. I have the papers here." "That won't be necessary, Mr. Blackwood." Noah's deep voice carried clearly through the morning air as he emerged from around the house corner, Matthew and Jonas following close behind. Snow dusted their broad-brimmed hats and plain dark coats. Isabella's heart quickened at Noah's steady presence, though confusion clouded her mind. What could he do against the bank's claim? The banker's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Stoltzfus, this is a private matter of property law." "Indeed it is." Noah reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded document. "Which is why my brothers and I purchased the note on this farm 3 weeks ago." Isabella's breath caught. The sheriff's eyes widened, and Mr. Blackwood took an unconscious step backward. "We could not heal hearts and let hunger claim homes," Noah continued, his voice gentle but firm. "It would go against everything we believe." He unfolded the paper, and Isabella recognized the bank's official letterhead. The sheriff let out a low whistle. "You bought out the entire debt?" "For the full amount." Noah nodded. "The Lord provides ways to serve if we but listen." Mr. Blackwood examined the document, his fingers trembling slightly. "This is completely in order. The Stoltzfus brothers now hold all legal claim to the Beeman property." Isabella's legs felt weak. She gripped the porch railing, watching as Noah took the papers back. But instead of putting them away, he turned to her. His eyes were warm with something that made her heart flutter. "Miss Beeman," he said formally, extending the deed toward her. "This belongs in your hands." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "But you bought it. The farm is yours." "We bought it to give it back." His smile deepened. "A home should belong to those who love it." Tears blurred Isabella's vision as she reached for the papers with shaking fingers. The sheriff removed his hat, snow settling on his gray hair. "This here's justice done God's way," he said softly. The sound of wagon wheels made them all turn. More neighbors were arriving, drawn perhaps by some sense that something extraordinary was happening at the Beeman farm. They gathered in small groups, murmuring in astonishment as word spread of what the brothers had done. Noah knelt in the snow, his head bowed. "Shall we thank the Lord together?" One by one, the others joined him, first his brothers, then Isabella, then the sheriff. Even Mr. Blackwood, after a moment's hesitation, bowed his head. The snow fell silently around them as Noah's clear voice rose in prayer. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for your mercy that makes all things new, for your love that redeems what was lost, for your grace that turns mourning into dancing." Isabella kept her eyes closed, tears freezing on her cheeks. The weight of the deed in her hands felt like a miracle. Not just paper and ink, but a physical sign of God's provision. Through her tears, she whispered her own prayer of gratitude for this man who had brought such healing to her life, who had shown her that love could restore what shame had broken. The quiet "Amen" that rose from the gathered neighbors seemed to hang in the crisp morning air like a blessing. As they rose from prayer, Isabella saw something new in their faces. Not pity or judgment, but respect and wonder at this demonstration of God's love, made visible through sacrificial mercy. The days following Noah's redemption of the farm brought a flurry of activity that warmed hearts despite the deepening winter chill. Word spread quickly through the small Kansas community, and by sunrise the next morning, wagons lined the snow-dusted lane leading to the Beeman farm. Men arrived with tools slung over their shoulders, women carried baskets of food, and children tagged along, eager to help however they could. Isabella stood amazed as neighbors she hadn't seen in months stepped forward to offer assistance. Even those who had once whispered behind her back now smiled warmly, touched by the brothers' act of mercy. The spirit of community that had seemed lost was flowering again, nurtured by this visible demonstration of God's love. "Folks aim to see this barn razed before the real winter sets in," Sheriff Mitchell explained, rolling up his sleeves. "Ain't right for a farm to stand without its heart." Noah organized the workers with quiet efficiency, his experience showing in every measured word and gesture. He grouped the men into teams, some clearing debris while others prepared new timber. The sound of saws and hammers soon filled the crisp air, punctuated by encouraging shouts and laughter. Isabella found her own role naturally, setting up a makeshift kitchen in the yard where women could warm themselves while preparing meals for the workers. She kept the coffee pot bubbling and bread baking, the familiar tasks bringing comfort after so many days of uncertainty. The children, rather than being shooed away, were given small tasks that made them feel important. Isabella gathered them during breaks, teaching them hymns she remembered from her own childhood. Their sweet voices rose above the construction noise, bringing smiles to tired faces. "Jesus loves me, this I know," they sang while helping to stack kindling, their small hands working in rhythm with the melody. In the evenings, after the other workers had gone home, Noah would find Isabella and teach her about building. He showed her how to read blueprints spread out on makeshift tables, explaining the importance of proper measurements and strong foundations. "See here," he would say, his finger tracing lines on paper. "Faith builds with what's at hand. We take broken pieces and make them strong again." His gentle voice gave the lessons deeper meaning, and Isabella found herself learning about more than just construction. The work progressed steadily despite the cold. Every day brought visible progress, new beams rising against the pale winter sky, walls taking shape, the roof gradually spreading its protective wings over the structure. The brothers' expertise guided every step, but it was the community's determination that truly raised the barn. Matthew and Jonas worked tirelessly alongside the others, their quiet strength and inspiration. They spoke little, but smiled often, especially when Isabella brought them hot coffee or fresh bread. Their presence reminded everyone that faith showed itself best through actions, not words. One bright afternoon, as the sun began its early winter descent, Noah called everyone together. The final beam was ready to be raised. Men positioned themselves along guide ropes while women and children gathered to watch. The massive timber rose slowly, steadied by many hands, until it settled into place with a solid thunk that seemed to echo with finality. Someone began to sing, the words of "Amazing Grace" floating up into the cold air. Others joined in, voices harmonizing in the ancient hymn of redemption. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she sang, remembering all the times she'd felt lost, now found again through God's mysterious ways. The barn stood complete as darkness fell, its new lanterns glowing warmly against the gathering night. Stars emerged in the clear sky above, mirrored by the lights below. Workers gathered their tools, accepting final cups of coffee and slices of bread before heading home, satisfaction evident in their tired faces. Later that evening, Noah asked Isabella to come to the workshop he'd set up in the barn's corner. There, illuminated by lantern light, stood a beautifully crafted cradle. Its smooth wood gleamed with careful polishing, and delicate carvings of wheat and flowers decorated the sides. "I made this from the leftover wood," Noah said softly, his hands resting on the cradle's curved edge. "For any child God sends, in his own way." Isabella touched the polished wood, her fingers tracing the carved designs. The cradle represented more than just skilled craftsmanship. It was a declaration of hope, a testament to possibilities she had thought forever closed. "Every child needs a place to rest," Noah continued, his voice gentle. "Whether they come by birth or are led here by the Lord's hand. This farm has room for all the love He provides." Standing there in the new barn's warm glow, surrounded by the fresh scent of wood and the evidence of community restored, Isabella felt the last walls around her heart crumble away. The cradle wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a promise that her life, like the barn, could be rebuilt into something beautiful and strong. Spring crept across Kansas like a gentle awakening. As March winds softened into April breezes, the snow retreated to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the dark earth of the Beeman fields. Where barrenness had ruled, life stirred again. Isabella settled into her new roles with quiet joy. Each morning found her at the church schoolhouse she'd helped restore, teaching not just children but also women who'd never had the chance to learn their letters. She shared Noah's carpentry lessons too, showing them how to sand wood smooth and measure twice before cutting. "Miss Beeman," little Sarah Turner called out one morning, holding up a small wooden box she'd made. "Is this straight enough?" Isabella smiled, remembering how Noah had taught her the same patience with careful measurements. "That's fine work," she said, touching the child's shoulder. "You're learning well." Noah's weekly visits became the rhythm that marked time. Every Wednesday, his wagon would appear on the horizon, loaded with new benches for the school or tools sized for smaller hands. He always arrived quietly, but his presence filled the room like sunshine through windows. The children adored him, gathering around as he demonstrated how to hold a saw or plane wood properly. But his gentle eyes sought Isabella most often, watching her move among her students with growing admiration. One Sunday after classes ended, while the late afternoon light painted everything gold, Noah found Isabella arranging hymn books. "I've been thinking," he said softly, "about building my next barn." He paused, then added with careful hope, "Close enough to hear your singing while I work?" Isabella's cheeks flushed pink as spring roses, but her eyes met his steadily. "I'd like that," she whispered. That evening, they walked together along the ridge overlooking both their lands, their fingers twined naturally together, like roots seeking soil. Meadowlarks trilled their evening songs in the tall grass, accompanying their slow steps as the sun painted the sky in shades of promise. The harvest moon rose full and bright over Kansas that autumn, blessing a landscape transformed. Where empty barns had once stood, new timbers gleamed solid and true. Golden wheat rippled across fields that just seasons ago lay barren and broken. Isabella's schoolhouse bell rang clear each morning, calling children and grown folk alike to learn. Her laughter, once silenced by shame, now brightened the yard as she taught reading and woodcraft with equal care. At the harvest celebration, Noah stood before the gathered town. His quiet voice carried across the hushed crowd. "This community learned mercy," he said, "by watching one woman's steadfast grace through trial." His eyes found Isabella's. "She taught us all how to rebuild with faith." The children shuffled forward then, carrying her old carving rescued from the barn loft. The words she'd cut deep in the wood still spoke true. "The Lord restoreth the broken. He makes the barren fields flower again." Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks as Noah took her hand in his. As dusk settled, they stood together beside the rebuilt barn, once a place of her deepest shame, now standing tall as hope made visible. Fireflies rose like stars around them, and the schoolhouse bell tolled once more, ringing out pure joy across the gentle land. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.